behavior and this performance is supported by institutions. It's supported by rules, regulations, informal practices. And these are really about what is expected and what is acceptable. So, for instance, when you think of gender as performative, we perform it in the context of what most often in the context of what is acceptable. And of course, we know that over a period of time, uh, mm, we do. One second. Yeah. So we know that over a period of time, um, over a period of, yeah, can you keep it at that? Yeah. So over a period of time, it is possible to therefore change the kind of performance that we do. Um, So if you think back to women in the domestic space versus women sort of entering the public space, it's sort of moving out of the private into the public space, getting into formal work and formal organizations, you realize that there has been a shift in the way that women particularly perform their gender. So, so it's possible to think about how we move beyond the expected and acceptable forms of our sex, sexuality, and gender. And even though, we're saying two things. One, that gender is a continuous process. It is a continuous process of performing certain rules, regulations, and roles. This performative process is shaped by the institutional powers, by certain institutional frames of what the rules and regulations are and should be. But that because it is continuous, it is also subject to change. And so it's possible to rethink and reimagine these expected and acceptable forms of sex, sexuality, and gender. And what is normal, natural, and acceptable varies from society to society, from one historical period to another, and it may also differ within the individual. So, in my sort of time, how I performed my gender maybe 10 years back and how I perform it today, I think there is a difference. So in some senses, despite the fact that um, we think of gender as we think of gender as given and as something that is framed by these institutional powers. We also know that there is a domain of freedom and agency, which means that we are able to shape what gender means, and we think of gender as a domain of freedom and agency when we conceive of it theoretically as something that is performative, as something that we make what this gender is. Yeah, next slide, Himanshu, please. So that brings me to this, to when we think of gender and sexuality and so on, what the social practices that are associated with being a man or woman, these are, you can think of them in terms of masculinity and femininity. So when I think of what is that moral framing, what is that societal framing, we can think of these in terms of masculinity and femininity, which is what are the roles that we do perform, what are the roles that we think about. So this aspect of having certain norms, this aspect of performing your gender, these are to be understood as representing masculinity and femininity. And as I said before, there are social, cultural, historical, and temporal variations in masculinity and femininity in how we perform our genders. Now, broadly, I think, and this is also discussed in the literature, masculinity tends to have a higher ranking than femininity. So you see that, and we will link this to the concept of patriarchy because of the way in which society is structured, the way in which women's roles were largely considered to be within the household and were therefore, despite the significance of um, reproduction and women as central to the reproductive role, um, you know, masculinity tends to be ranked higher than femininity. Now, uh, so 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 you have sort of a set of practices, and again, this is beyond sort of beyond individual to a certain extent beyond individual control, the ranking of masculinity and femininity. And so masculinity then needs to be performed in that way, in the way that it is suggestive of this higher ranking. And this is what brings us to the notion of hegemonic masculinity and subordinated masculinities, which is hegemonic masculinity means that there is a dominant, powerful expression of what it means to be a man. And all of us have to submit in some ways to that dominant, powerful notion of what it means to be a man. Of course, given that gender is performative, all men do not perform hegemonic masculinity, right? And hegemonic masculinity would therefore mean a kind of what is called a kind of hyper masculinity, where the characteristics of being male or being manly are are really enhanced, right? And now, within that, given that we have this idea of hegemonic masculinity, and we know that people, all men do not perform this idea of hegemonic masculinity. Other sorts of performances get represented as subordinated masculinities. So masculinities that are again ranked sort of lower than this idea of hegemonic masculinity. So characteristics or attitudes like bravery, like physical strength, um, ability to control, all of these would get understood, would be understood in terms of hegemonic masculinity. Now, again, going back to the idea of of performance and gender as performance, and there being room for freedom and agency within this performance. And we know that both masculinity and femininity then are not carved in stone. They're not sort of fixed categories. There is a lot of fluidity in the way that we perform our genders. So now, when I introduce the idea of fluidity, then it's important to see that that even this sort of masculinity slash femininity then does not work. So if I were to extend the idea that we perform our genders, and we know that there are several things that we do within our own sort of uh, uh, gender roles. And so the idea of fluidity then also enables me to think beyond the gender binary. That when if I consider gender to be a category that is fluid, I know that I can't just think of it in terms of male and female, masculine and feminine, but then I have to begin to question this kind of binary division. Um, uh, So I had a small film clip. Just if you give me 2 minutes, I'm going to try and pull it out and put it here, and one of you can play it. Um,
Ma'am, just one thing. What exactly is agency? You tell. I could not understand. You said that being room for freedom and agency.
yeah.
What does
So
that means?
agency, yeah. So agency is the ability to act act in accordance with your own sense and understanding of gender, and not be completely dictated by sort of external structural forces. So when you think of gender, as I said before, it is within certain contexts. So part of why we are looking at gender as an institution is to think about how it is embedded in the institutions of marriage, family, kinship, and so on, right? So the institutions where you learn what your gender is, where you're socialized into your gender, is really family and kinship. Those are the first institutions where you learn about what it means to perform your gender, right? So I think, for instance, if you think about um, the simplest thing is boys and crying. You're taught very early that boys don't cry, and you're taught about sort of suppressing emotion, of not giving in to that emotion. So if you're disappointed, if you're hurt, if you're angry and you have tears, you're told very early that this is not the way boys behave. Girls aren't necessarily told that. So I think so that becomes a kind of that's a kind of difference in the way that we are socialized, in the way that we are made to understand that those social and cultural practices that are associated with being a man or a woman. Now, these are social and cultural practices, so they will be different in different societies. So in some societies, for instance, that distinction may not be that clear uh, between masculinity and femininity. There may be more of an overlap between between these ideas. So agency is really the ability to or the force with which you um, decide to perform. In the case of gender, and decide to perform your gender identity, irrespective of what kind of hold the social and cultural practices around gender have on you. Uh, does that answer your question?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
Understood.
Yeah. Um, Let me try to pull up the.
And ma'am, internal forces are the society.
Uh, well, the internal, no, external. So society, social structure, all of that is external to you. They're the ones. They're the kinds of things that place constraints on your behavior. So, are you able to? To what extent are you able to um, sort of resist these structural forces and fashion your behavior as something that is your very own? And again, as I think, said before also, that there is, if you look at this notion of structure, where you're talking about structure and agency, right? So this is a question that is fundamental in sociology, that to what extent does the structure shape what we do? And to what extent is our individual will and our freedom able to shape the structure and shape what we do? So when we think of gender, I think we understand that a lot of what we do in our own gender, like as a woman, what I do, is shaped by these social structures, the social structures of family, of kinship, of and of the dominant understanding of what is masculine and what is feminine behavior. So that is the structure that I work within that structure. I think I said I had given this example before, that one of the things that you that make our genders is in terms of, or shape our gender behavior is in terms of what is acceptable, but what is, so it's a kind of routine accomplishment. You have to consistently keep on accomplishing your gender. It's not enough to just be male or female. We perform it all the time, and whenever you if you try to sort of resist, or you try to do your gender in some other way, uh, it is it is questioned. So if you think about those clips that we saw, those film clips on advertisements, you remember there is one of the, I think, beer ads has this thing about um, uh, the friends teasing this man about not doing something masculine, and this is the second non-masculine thing or whatever that you've done. So there are, then what that shows us is that there are behavior and characteristics which are seen as masculine or non-masculine, feminine or non-feminine, and that is associated with the social and cultural practices of the time in a particular society. Right? So that's the structure. And how we respond to that structure, what we do in relation to it, are we completely aligned to those structural aspects, or do we have something which resists those structural aspects, which goes against those structural aspects? And that shows the kind of individual will and individual freedom. And so will and freedom, I'm also using then the term agency, that to what extent we are agents, we are forces of our own making, and to what extent do these external things shape who we are.
For some reason, it
Who should I share it with? Himanshu, can you send?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, your email, Gmail.
You can share it.
Yes, yes, ma'am.
Ma'am, you can also share it with me. I can also.
Okay, yeah, sorry, I did. Okay, I'll share it with you. Vaibhav, did you get it? Ah, great.
Yes, ma'am.
So we'll see this short clip from a documentary film that I made several years ago on, and it shows us this idea of the performance of masculinity and femininity. The film is called Being Male, Being Koti, and it's available on YouTube. So if anybody is interested in seeing the half-an-hour documentary, you can go ahead and do that.
Should I start?
Yeah, you can start.
Just let me know if the audio is working fine.
For some reason, it freaked them out.
আজকে তুমি যে রিককে দেখছো এই মুহূর্তে যে রিককে দেখছো রিকি কিন্তু এই রিকি কিন্তু লিখে গেলে পরে একটা আলাদা পারফরমেন্স
Vaibhav, can you just minimize the other windows? Sorry, because it's what we are seeing is your screen and then the PPT, and so that it's layered.
Okay, I'll just.
Yeah, that's better.
আমি অনেক বেশি লাউডলি কথা বলবো হাহা করে হাসবো ইটস মোর অফ পারফরমেন্স when I come together to close to my people আমি না সত্যি আজকে নিজেকে কোনোভাবে পুরুষালী বা মেয়েলি বলে ডিফাইন করতে পারি না আমি আজকে মনে করি আমি আজকে মানে দুটো একটা অ্যাসিমিলেটেড পজিশনে আমি আছি যদি আমি হাত দিয়ে পুরুষালী হই মানে তথাকথিত ভাবে ততক্ষণ আমি মেয়েলি রয়েছি ইটস এ কম্বিনেশন যেটা মানে কোনো কাছে কাউকে কিন্তু হেয় করে না কোথাও হচ্ছে এমনটা জায়গা যার মধ্যে একটা অবস্থান আছে পুরুষ এবং নারীর এবং দুটো রিফ্লেক্টেড আমার চরিত্রের মধ্যে হয় সব ট্রেটস আমার মধ্যে দেখা যায় সুতরাং আমি নিজে কিন্তু সেরকমভাবে কম্বাইন করতে পারি বলতে পারি না যে আমি এরকম পুরুষ এরকম নারী শুধুমাত্র আমার মানে বায়োলজিক্যাল এক্সিস্টেন্স ছাড়া আমি যা দেখি মানে উই অল আর ডিফারেন্ট উই অল আর রাস্তা আমি আমার বাড়িতে পরিবারের কথাই বলছি আজকে আমার বাবা যতখানি পুরুষালী বাবাকে দিন পুরুষ মানে দাদাও পুরুষ আমিও পুরুষ এবং বাবার সঙ্গে নিশ্চয় দাদার অনেক ডিফারেন্স আছে সুতরাং these are I would rather say Koti is an kind of individual's expression. Koti is not a sexual identity. It's a gender construction. আমার কাছে কতির জন্য কোনো পুরুষ মানুষের ভালো লাগার প্রয়োজন নেই I'm in total comfort with myself. আমি নিজেকে ভীষণ ভালোবাসি এবং আমার এই ভালোবাসাটাকে আমি যথেষ্ট সন্তুষ্ট এর জন্য আলাদা কোনো পুরুষ লাগবে বলে আমার মনে হয় না এখন কতিত্ব হ্যাজ গট নাথিং টু ডু উইথ পুরুষ মানুষের ভালোবাসা কতি তো নিজের কাছে ব্যাপারটা কতি ইজ নাথিং টু ডু উইথ অন দ্য বেড
এটা হলো না আর উনি মাঝে মাঝে সেন্স বলে যাচ্ছিস তুই অনেক
অনেকগুলি shades বলি আমরা masculinity তাহলে it's a different shade of masculinity. I am totally in comfort with my physical existence, what I am, whatever I am. বাবা মাঝে মাঝে এখনো বলে যে বেটা ছেলে হলি তো কোনোদিনও ফুটবল লাথি মারতে পারি না আমি আমাকে বললাম ওকে এক্সকিউজ মি আমার ভালো লাগেনি লাগতে তো কি আছে আপনি আমার নাচতে ভালোবাসি আমি আমার ঘরে কাজ করতে খুব বেশি ভালো লাগে আমার গান গাইতে খুব ভালো লাগে আমার ক্রিয়েটিভ কাজ করতে খুব ভালো লাগে কিন্তু আমার ফুটবল লাথি মারটা আমার জীবনের নেসেসারি অঙ্গ নয় বলে মনে করেছি ফুটবল লাথি মারলে কেবল পৃথিবী অসুস্থ হয়ে গেছে আমি হয়ে উঠতে পারিনি আর ফুটবল লাথি মারাটা কি বিশাল পুরুষোচিত কাজ নাকি
একটা সময় শুনতাম যে it was men with feminine.
All right, so see again, even though it was in Bengali, there are subtitles. So you see the point that I think this clip really makes that point about uh, gender as a kind of performance, and the way in which there are certain external characteristics that define what is the ideal notion of masculinity. So this Reek, this character in the film, is actually talking about something as simple as playing football. And this is Bengal. And so growing up in Bengal, a lot of these young men who displayed sort of other kinds of masculine, not whose representations and whose performance were not strictly within the ambit of masculinity as is defined, would find that they were being pushed into playing football, and that became that's a sort of, again, that's a kind of cultural marker of growing up as a young boy and then as a man and so on. So this clip also brings out then the idea of fluidity, about how that gender really cannot be defined in terms of this kind of social structure, in terms of the structures, but rather, as we engage, as different people engage with the structures, we create these sorts of fluid identities. And of course, it's a long way to go to imagine a world that is non-gendered, to think about to think about the possibility that we won't have to mention our genders, and it'll be a genderless world in that sense. But I think it's an interesting thought experiment to do, to try and think about what this would mean, and how some of the kinds of hegemonic ways in which, or dominant and powerful and even violent ways in which gender um, is there in our lives, gender identities, the kind of violence that it creates for many people in their lives, that would perhaps be, perhaps could be done away with. Next slide, I think. Yeah, so it's important then to think of these performances and what we do in our genders in the context of the institution of patriarchy. It's also important in the context of what we were thinking about earlier in terms of gender, in terms of family and kinship. And we discussed the patrilineal system, and we know that the patrilineal system is basically also patriarchal, a social system where there is a male head of the family, and it's the oldest male in the family who acts as the head. Descent, property, inheritance is along male line, and the norms of being within the family and the kinship unit and being in society are norms that are maintained by the male elders in the community. They are the ones who decide what is just and what is fair and what is right. So it was in the 1960s that it really came to be, patriarchy really came to be a category, an analytical category within sociology, in order to understand the subjugation of women in the world. Why do women have sort of these inferior roles? Why this sort of ranking is done of women's roles, of women's place in society? And that is connected to patriarchy, to who controls these gender roles. So patriarchy then is also seen as the subordination of women by men, and the sort of reproducing of structures that create conditions which are unfavorable to women. And of course, even as I say this, we know that, okay, there have been changes, several things have altered. So to think of women as having no agency, as having no freedom or individual will within the system is problematic. And we know that women do have do have a sort of individualistic role and decision-making roles to play within the system. But overall, I think largely for women and for men, patriarchy is a system, is a social system that you cannot, the presence of which you cannot deny. So the unequal gender relations that we see are don't affect just women, it also implicates men. Vaibhav, I think I have shared with you another short clip. And again, this really brings to light what, what is patriarchy. This is a clip with, there was this Satyameva Jayate some years ago, which Amir Khan used to do. And it's a clip with Kamala Bhasin, who recently passed away, but she was a very, very fiery and, feminist activist. And so it's a clip with her talking about explaining what is patriarchy. So let's first see that, and then we can discuss it. Again, this is actually in Hindi, so we can, and it does, I don't think it has subtitles, but I hope most of you will be able to follow, and otherwise we can also just take questions and have a discussion on it.
Ma'am, is the screen visible?
Yeah, it is.
ये मानसिकता कहाँ से आती है?
इसको हम लोग अपनी जबान में कहते हैं पितृसत्तात्मक सोच है। पितृसत्ता एक सोशल सिस्टम है जो औरत को कमतर समझता है, मर्द को बेहतर समझता है।
जी जी।
पिदरशाही कह लें, पेट्रियार्की कह लें।
जी जी।
आप किस पर हाथ उठा सकते हैं? कोई मर्द अपने बॉस पर तो कभी हाथ नहीं उठाता, अपने से सीनियर पर तो उसका हाथ कभी नहीं उठता।
जी।
हाथ हमारा उस पर उठता है जिसको हम कमतर समझते हैं, कमजोर समझते हैं। तो पितृसत्ता जो है, ये सोच बाकायदा सिस्टमैटिकली रोजाना पैदा करती है। फिर हमारी परंपराएं, राखी पर, रक्षाबंधन पर भाई खड़ा हो जाता है बड़ा होकर, चाहे मैं उसको पढ़ा रही हूँ, मगर राखी पर वो कहता है मैं तेरी रक्षा करूंगा। अरे तेरी रक्षा मैं 15 साल से कर रही हूँ भैया, तेरी नाक जब से बह रही थी, मगर राखी पर मुझे फिर वहीं लाके खड़ा कर दिया जाएगा कि तू नीचे है, रक्षा तेरी ये करेगा। एक बहुत अच्छा उदाहरण है करवा चौथ का त्योहार। अब करवा चौथ औरत रखती है ताकि मेरे पति को कुछ गलत ना हो जाए,
उसको लंबी उम्र लगे,
उसे लंबी उम्र लगे। अगर यही सोच है तो फिर अमेरिका के सब पतियों को तो मर जाना चाहिए था अब तक, क्योंकि
करवा चौथ
नहीं रखते। आप हमारी जबान देख लें, भाषा देख लें, जिस आदमी से हमारी शादी होती है उसे हिंदी में हम कहते हैं पति
जी।
अब आप देखें पति का मतलब क्या? ओनर, मालिक, करोड़पति, जो करोड़ का मालिक है।
करोड़पति करोड़ का मालिक,
करोड़ का मालिक,
लाख का मालिक।
बेशक। तो पति का मतलब स्वामी,
मालिक।
और लॉजिकली आप देखें कि अगर एक स्वामी है तो लॉजिकली दूसरा क्या है? दास है। आपकी जबान में हस्बैंड वाइफ के रिश्ते के लिए कोई और दूसरा लफ्ज ही नहीं है, तो भाई क्यों ना मारे? वो मालिक है और मार के उसको ठीक जगह रख सकता है।
तो इस सोच को कैसे बदलें?
देखो, जहां तक औरतों की सोच को बदलने की बात है, हम लोग बहुत सालों से उस पर काम कर रहे हैं। पिछले 15-20 साल से मेरी तो जो खास चीज है वो ये है कि अब लड़कों और मर्दों को बदलना होगा। क्योंकि मारता कौन है? मर्द। ज्यादा हिंसा कौन करता है समाज में? मर्द। और ये ऐसे पैदा नहीं हुए, ये कोई जिस्मानी चीज नहीं है कि मर्द है तो वो हिंसात्मक होगा। अगर ऐसा होता तो दुनिया में ना बुद्ध होते ना महात्मा गांधी होते, और वो 60% मर्द जो नहीं मारते किसी को, वो कैसे होते?
तो मर्द ही हैं। बिल्कुल बिल्कुल सही कहा आपने।
आप उसको कहते हैं कि तू रोएगा नहीं, माँ मर जाती है, मर्द नहीं रोते।
उनको लगता है ये उनकी मर्दानगी
के खिलाफ।
अच्छा, मैं बहुत रोता हूँ, मैं आपको बता दूं।
तो आप पूरे मर्द नहीं हो मियाँ, आपको कुछ करना पड़ेगा। मर्द दुनिया की हर चीज पर बात कर लेंगे, मगर अपने ऊपर, खासतौर से अपनी कमजोरी का बयान नहीं कर सकते, क्योंकि मर्दानगी का मतलब है कमजोर ना होना। मैं ये समझती हूँ कि पितृसत्ता मर्दों को डीह्यूमनाइज कर रही है, उनकी मानवीयता छीन रही है, उनकी इंसानियत छीन रही है।
तो इसमें मर्दों का भी नुकसान है, बहुत बड़ा नुकसान है।
बहुत बड़ा नुकसान।
मुझे ये बताइए कि अगर किसी औरत को मारा जाता है तो वो क्यों सह लेती है, वो क्यों फर्म स्टेप नहीं लेती?
जिस कुएं से मर्द पानी पीते हैं उसी कुएं से हम औरतें भी पानी पीती हैं। तो अगर मर्द पितृसत्तात्मक है तो हम भी पितृसत्तात्मक हैं, क्योंकि हमें भी तो यही सिखाया है, हमारे मजहब ने यही सिखाया है, हमारी संस्कृति ने यही सिखाया है,
परंपरा ने यही
सिखाया है। तो हम भी ये समझती हैं कि हम कमतर हैं। तो मैं यही मानती हूँ कि दोष मर्दों या औरतों का नहीं है, दोष पितृसत्तात्मक सोच का है, जो हम सब के अंदर है। इसीलिए बहुत अधिकतर औरतें चुपचाप
सह लेती।
बिल्कुल।
मुझे बताइए कि ये हर तबके में होता है?
मिडिल क्लास में शायद ज्यादा होता है, क्योंकि मिडिल क्लास में औरत को बोझ समझा जाता है। आदिवासियों में, काम काज करने वालों में औरत कहीं ज्यादा आजाद है। अगर वो पिटेगी तो वो चिल्लाएगी कि देखो मार रहा है। कितनी मिडिल क्लास औरतें हैं मध्यम वर्ग की जो अपने पति को
जो चिल्लाएंगी और कहेंगी देखो मुझे मार रहा है,
और उसको गाली देंगी।
वो तो छुपाती हैं इस बात,
छुपाती है। लग गया तो दूसरे दिन काला चश्मा लगा के जाएंगी कि नो आई फेल डाउन।
कई औरतें कहती हैं कि वो तो मुझे प्यार करता है, तो वो प्यार में मुझे मार रहा है, चूंकि वो मुझे प्यार करता है वो मुझे मार रहा है। ये क्या सोच है?
तो फिर इसका मतलब है कि हम तो मर्दों को बिल्कुल प्यार नहीं करते, क्योंकि हम उनको पीटते नहीं है सुबह से शाम तक।
तो अगर तुम प्यार करती हो तो उतना ही मारो जितना पति तुमको मारता है, तब तो उसको समझ में आएगा कि भैया मैं प्यार करती हूँ तुमसे।
बिल्कुल।
हमें ये भी सुनने में आता है कि बहुत सारे मर्द सोचते हैं कि भैया हम दिन भर काम करके आते हैं तो हम बड़ी थकान लेके आते हैं, फिर जो है वो फ्रस्ट्रेशन जो है हमारा वो घर पे निकलता है, औरतों पे हमारा हाथ उठ जाता है।
पहली बात तो आप देखिए, जितनी रिसर्चेज हुई हैं वो बताती हैं कि औरतें मर्दों से ज्यादा लंबे घंटे काम करती हैं। आप हर घर में देख लें कौन पहले उठता है और कौन बाद में सोता है। तो औरत मर्दों से 5, 6, 7 घंटे ज्यादा काम करती है हर जगह। ये इंटरनेशनल लेबर ऑर्गेनाइजेशन की वो है रिसर्च। तो भैया कोई अगर थका हुआ है तो वो औरत है। इसके साथ साथ वो बच्चे पैदा करती है, बच्चों को संभालती है, इतनी इमोशनल जिम्मेदारी है। तो ये सब कहने की बातें हैं। ये तो वही है भैया, जिसकी लाठी उसकी भैंस है। पितृसत्ता की वजह से मर्दों के हाथ में लाठी है तो वो कुछ ना कुछ कह के उसका इस्तेमाल करते हैं, किसी ना किसी तरह उसको जस्टिफाई करते हैं।
कमला जी, मर्द ये कहते हैं कि वो पैसा कमा के घर लाते हैं, वो ब्रेड विनर है, तो लिहाजा उनको हक बनता है कि वो हाथ उठा सकते हैं।
इसमें 2-3 बातें हैं। वो जो ब्रेड विनर है ना, वो लाता पैसा है। बच्चे पैसा नहीं खाते, बच्चे खाना खाते हैं। बच्चे पैसे पर नहीं सोते, बच्चे बिस्तर पर सोते हैं। तो औरत उस पैसे को खाना बनाती है, उस पैसे का बिस्तर बनाती है। तो मर्द और औरत दोनों मिलकर जब काम करते हैं तब परिवार चलते हैं। दूसरी बात, ये औरत की मेहनत है जो मर्द को दूसरे दिन काम पर जाने के लायक बनाती है। शाम को मर्द थका हुआ आता है, कहता है मैं डेड टायर्ड हूं। तो उनकी थकान कैसे जाती है? उनकी बीवी उनके पैर धुलवाएगी, वहां से पिट के आए हैं, वहां से बेइज्जत होके आए हैं, तो वो उनके टूटे हुए अहम को दोबारा खड़ा करेगी, खाना खिलाएगी, मोहब्बत देगी, रात को मन उनका बहलाएगी, दूसरे दिन सुबह उनका नाश्ता देगी, उनके कपड़े चमकाएगी, उनके जूते चमकाएगी। तब वो एग्जीक्यूटिव अपनी नौकरी पर जाएगा या वो मजदूर अपनी नौकरी पर जाएगा। तो औरत के इस काम के बिना मर्द नाकाम है। मैं लोगों से अक्सर अपनी वर्कशॉप्स में पूछती हूँ कि पितृसत्ता का उल्टा क्या है? आप बताएं, पितृसत्ता का उल्टा क्या है?
पितृसत्ता का
मातृसत्ता। टोटल गलत, जीरो मिला आपको।
जीरो मिला।
देखो, पितृसत्ता का उल्टा मातृसत्ता हो ही नहीं सकता, क्योंकि अगर पितृसत्ता गलत है
तो मातृसत्ता भी गलत।
बिल्कुल
सही।
तो पितृसत्ता का उल्टा है बराबरी। तो रियली मैं ये मानती हूँ कि ये जो लड़ाई है, ये औरत और मर्द के बीच की लड़ाई है ही नहीं। ये दो मानसिकताओं के बीच की लड़ाई है। एक सोच कहती है पितृसत्ता बेहतर है
और दूसरी सोच कहती है कि दोनों एक ही है,
बराबरी बेहतर है,
दोनों बराबर है,
बराबरी बेहतर है,
बराबरी बेहतर है, बिल्कुल सही।
जब तक घरों में
Okay, so as you see, I think that this is one of the sort of best articulations that I have found of both these things. First, what is patriarchy? And that's very well explained by Kamala Bhasin when she says that it is an attitude, it's a kind of thinking, and the thinking that creates a structure that then enables this kind of subordination of women by men. And the other aspect that she talks about is about women and work, and what is the nature of women's work, and how do we then conceive of equality within the family. And she says if you look at the work of women, that women work several hours more. There is a lot of work that they do which is completely unaccounted for. And in that context, she talks about what in sociology we know as emotional labor. The fact that so much of the work that women have to do is tied to sort of managing and managing and expressing emotions and feelings. So because of the nature of this work, I think, which is considered to be naturally sort of present in the lives and contexts of women, it is considered to not be work in that sense, is not accounted for work in that sense. And Kamala Bhasin actually points to how this must be accounted for, because this is what enables, if you think of the private as something that remains unaccounted for, it is this private domain that then enables the public to become possible, that the kind of work that happens in the public domain to become possible. But do you have any questions, or have you followed what we
Yes, ma'am, I followed. But ma'am, one thing I just want to clarify, that you said patriarchy is an analytic system. So what exactly analytic means? Is it that it's changing with time, varies from society to society, or it's something other than that, like some
So
thinking into subjective domain?
Yeah, that's a good question, Himanshu. What I was saying is that, so you initially, what we think of it as something that describes the rules, regulations, structures, and constraints of society. So it's a system by which, you have a male head of the family who takes all the decisions on behalf of all the other members of that family. And it is the male head of the family who determines what is right and wrong, what is just and fair. So this is a sort of description of what patriarchy is. Now, in the sort of 60s, when sociology came to be gendered and gender became a category that we were interested in, that is when we think of patriarchy not simply as a descriptive category, but as an analytical category. So by this I mean that it is here at this point that we start thinking about how patriarchy influences the lives of men and women differently, right? So we begin to think about this question of, what is the impact of this system. And when you think about the impact, you realize that this is what has led to and this is what sustains the subjugation of women. So it becomes, in sociology, it becomes a category not simply to understand gender roles and differences and so on, but also to think about the subjugation of women, to say that, okay, this is what we need to change. So, and I think again that comes up in the words of Kamla Bhasin, where she's saying that what we need to think about is what is its alternative. And so if this is a category that persists in society, how can these relations be altered? And so she says that how the way it can be altered is when you think about a system that is equal, that stresses equality. So the shift from patriarchy as a descriptive category to an analytical category was what I was trying to highlight. As a descriptive category, it doesn't sort of make the connections between patriarchy and the subjugation of women, between patriarchy and the differential way in which different people in the system are treated. So you kind of just accept that this is what it is. And so again, if I look at it in terms of, we were discussing initially when we talked about the approaches, if I think from a critical social science approach, which is what the feminists would fall under, thinking from a critical social science perspective, I can think of patriarchy as a system that I need to understand, because ultimately I want to change it, because this is what leads to the subjugation of women, the inequalities within family, marriage, kinship, and society at large. So yeah, 1 second. So that's the shift that we're talking about, from descriptive to analytical. Yeah, next slide. I think yeah, so I think this is again outlined in what Kamla Bhasin is saying. Work within paid work and work within the household. So paid work and housework, sexuality, culture, violence, and the state. All these aspects determine relations within patriarchal structures. And so if I think of paid work and the difference between paid work and housework is not paid. Because it is not paid, it is devalued. Sexuality is something that is intimate. It is supposed to be private. It is not supposed to be, it's not on display. It is not, and therefore, and also then it must be controlled. So it's the fact that it's confined to the realm of the private means that it is controlled. When we think of how and this also we've discussed before in terms of family and kinship, one of the roles of patriarchy is in fact to control sexuality, and really the sexuality of women. Now, what is the reason for this control? The reason for this control is so that there isn't the freedom of choice and there isn't agency in the context of marriage. So women are not in charge of their own sexuality. They're not in charge of their own desires. It has to be regulated by society, by patriarchy, because it is in this regulation that those relations of gender and caste and family and kinship can be reproduced. So if we want to carry on in the traditions of the family, in the traditions, along the lines of traditions of the kinship group, then the control of sexuality, women's sexuality, is essential. So then what happens is that sexuality then gets linked to honor, and this is something that we'll be discussing in a little bit more detail in our tutorials. And then the fact that violence is sort of the ultimate weapon in the hands of these structures, in the hands of those who control these structures. So violence is ultimately, violence is what could be used to ensure compliance, to ensure that the norms and rules of patriarchal relations are followed. And by extension, even though we are thinking of patriarchy as something that is within the domain of the family and kinship, actually by extension, the state is also a patriarchal state, because the state supports these patriarchal relations. So again, if you think about, for instance, the law and how the law is organized, there are many aspects in which we can see those relations of patriarchy. I think, and again, there have been big changes in some of this. I mean, for simple things like, who can sign what document, so I think that norms and laws and rules and regulations around the family, around individual life within kinship units, all of that in some way is connected to the institution of patriarchy. Now, when you think about, I think an example of trying to see this connection between something as large and sort of large as the state and what happens in the family and what happens in the kinship unit. So they're, on the face of it, they're far removed from each other. Not just in terms of physical distance, but also in terms of their domains, of their operation, and so on. And yet we are saying that there is a connection. When we look at patriarchy, we see that connection between the family and the state. And one domain where we can see this connection is in terms of, let's say, something like the honor killings. Now, even if there is a law which clearly prohibits this from happening, we know that the state is complicit in several in these sorts of crimes. So if I think about, and how is it complicit? It's complicit because if I think of the local, who's the local representative of the state in this context? If I think of the police thana, the policemen who are looking at a case of honor killing, we know that these, the policemen often will take decisions that are linked to the relations, to patriarchal relations, linked to the way in which the family and kinship group are actually thinking. So in that sense, when you think of the state, you can't think of the state as something very diffuse. The state, again, is performed by individuals who are part of these key structures. And therefore, they begin to think along the lines of patriarchy, along the lines of maintaining family honor and so on. So it's an example where you can see the the connection between the family, kinship, individual, male head of the family, patriarchy, and the state. So the state then is referred to as the patriarchal state. So yeah, I think yeah, I think so. That's about it with regard to patriarchy, I think. So then we can see that, yeah, that's fine. So when we think of, and I've already introduced this idea that the reason why we're looking, one of the reasons why we're sort of focusing on gender is also to think about this, the connection between different institutions, to think about this idea of embeddedness, something that we began our lectures with. And I said that this is a continuing argument that we're going to try and build and develop. What is the relationship between different institutional spaces? So if gender, caste, and patriarchy are different institutional spaces, what is the relationship between them? How does it come together? And so we see that there are three ways in which women's subordination is practiced in the context of caste. One is in terms of food and commensality. Second, in terms of sexuality and reproductive rights. And third, in terms of occupational mobility. So each of these are actually central to the performance of caste as well. And it falls on the women to actually carry on these boundaries, to through their behaviors, to bring into effect these sort of the traditional or the way in which behaviors are regulated within caste boundaries. So so the maintenance of caste boundaries is essential both for the established sexual division of labor, and also for a larger system of division of labor and community. So if you think about caste, it is connected to a system of division of labor in communities, and so it is women who very often women who ensure that this division of labor persists. Now again, you may say that one is talking of caste in a way that it is not directly applicable to our lives and context. And in terms of occupational continuity, I agree that in several urban contexts it may not be that applicable. But if you think about the fact that many of us have in fact migrated, many people have migrated from their villages to these urban contexts that you now find yourself in. And often when men migrate from the rural to the urban and women don't migrate, it is left to the women to actually carry on some of the traditions. So so the maintenance of caste boundaries is tied to the sexual division of labor. So one way, for instance, that in the so-called upper castes contexts, women are restricted to working within the house. It is men who are working outside the house, and it's important to maintain this division of labor in order for the notions of the honor of the caste group are maintained. So women working outside the house implies a kind of a breakdown of the status of that caste. And of course, as we saw in that article, where we compared kinship among the upper caste Brahmins and the marginal castes within the same village, we saw that the kind of agency and the kind of access that women had in comparatively in the two castes was very different. So in a kind of context where you see that this relationship between women and caste is visible, is both within the household and the family, and in terms of ownership and control over resources. So if you think about women's contribution in these contexts, in work and production, we know that very often women contribute equally or even more, but in terms of ownership and control, that is limited, because again, ownership and control is through the sort of male line. It's the men who retain ownership and control. Next slide, please.
Ma'am, I have a doubt.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Ma'am, can you elaborate or give me a clarity about caste boundary we are talking of in terms of women?
So I think what I'm trying to say here is that what kind of role do women play in maintaining and reproducing caste boundaries? So fundamentally, if women were given the choice to marry on their own, if women were given the choice to express their sexualities in the way that they wanted to, clearly the fear is that caste boundaries would no longer remain what they are, so that you would not be able to maintain caste boundaries if you allowed women to that kind of choice. Because what would happen is, if there is too much intermarrying, and this is the fear, if there is too much intermarrying, because one of the ways in which a caste group is maintained is through the principle of endogamy, that you can marry within your own caste, you cannot marry outside your caste, right? So there are rules for who you can marry, um, and so therefore it is when children are born out of that union that the caste group continues and is perpetuated, right? If you didn't marry within your caste, if there was too much intermarrying, then what would happen? You would, again, then, a particular caste group will not be able to, it is possible that the particular caste group will not be able to perpetuate itself, right? So there is always the fear that a fear of the implications of allowing women to choose, the implications of sexual freedom for women in the context of family and kinship. So when I think about caste boundaries, and if I think about caste boundaries in terms of food and the rules and regulations around sharing of food, utensils, etc., commensality. And much of this is maintained by women, because it is women who run the household in terms of the kitchen, preparing the food. So if you think of the ritualistic norms around caste in terms of what kind of food to cook on what kind of days. So all of those norms are actually being carried out by women, right? Who can eat and what kind of utensils, what is, how is water to be served, how is tea to be served, all of those, there are rules around that, and those rules are being followed and brought into effect by women. And secondly, the way in which women are subject to this kind of control over their sexuality within the family, which is that sexuality is something that cannot be expressed in the realm of the public, it cannot go out of the family and the household, and that it is the men's prerogative. The men choose who the woman can engage with in what kind of sexual union. So it's not the women's prerogative, because if women are given the choice, then the idea of the continuity of caste is going to be jeopardized in some way or the other. So so then women play a very important role in maintaining the caste boundaries, precisely by following the rules of endogamy, by ensuring that the caste group is actually reproduced. Does that answer your question?
Yes, ma'am. And ma'am, one last thing, ma'am. What does the last word you tell, endogamy, following the rules of endogamy? Other than that, I understood.
So endogamy is what is the rule? That you cannot marry outside your caste.
Okay, so ma'am, is it that that caste boundary is something which woman is subjected to, restricted, and she is supposed to be following that, the thing that a patriarchy allows them to be? Can we say that? Because there are other things we already explained, you already explained, but this was, I am just aware.
So
Like, can we use that definition as well?
So caste boundaries, so here we are saying that gender, caste and patriarchy are linked. We are trying to understand what is that link. The link really is that, I mean, you can see the link between caste and patriarchy, because it is who controls the caste group, who controls the family, who controls the idea of caste within the family. It is the male head of the household, right? So ultimately the male head of the household will decide the rules of marriage, right? And the caste group, we know, can be maintained only if you continue to be within your caste group, only if you continue to reproduce within your caste group. So, right, so if I don't marry within my caste group, if I marry outside my caste group, what happens? The children born out of that union will be children of that caste group. They're not my, it's not my caste group anymore, right? So if a Kshatriya marries a Vaishya, then what happens is that it's the male, because it's the male line that determines the caste group. So essentially what it means is that in order for continuity, caste group continuity, marriage, sexual union, and the bearing and rearing of children has to be controlled. This is controlled by patriarchy. Which means that the power to make these decisions are invested in the male heads of the household. Inevitably, this means that those who are younger, both younger men as well as all women, are subject to these rules, which, I mean, of course, which are carried out by the male head of the household, but which are not necessarily made by the male head of the household. So they're necessarily made within these, the rules are really of these larger structures of caste, of patriarchy, of kinship group, of the idea of honor, of the idea of the biradari, the extended kin network. So these are the cultural codes through which these decisions are ultimately taken and made, right? So yes, in order to think about how women play a role in caste, women's lives are significant in maintaining caste because of the maintenance through the regulation of their sexuality, because of their maintenance through maintaining the rules around food and commensality, and because in certain contexts they're responsible for the occupation, maintaining occupational continuity. So in cases where the men have moved out and migrated and the women remain in the village, it is up to the women to then carry on occupational continuity. So the men may have moved out and started working in factories, but the women continue the traditional work that the men were actually originally doing. So you see here again that women take on the dual responsibility, which is that of running the household, which was their original responsibility, and also then perform their tasks, the roles that the men would perform in the caste-based occupations. So, the example of, the fact that if you have, for instance, barbers and washermen castes would continue to, if the men moved out, the women would continue to render the services in the village in order to, again, keep alive that occupational continuity.
Yes, ma'am, I understood clearly.
Yeah, okay. I think we can move to the next slide. Vaibhav? So, so this is, this is broadly what we, in terms of how caste and how gender, caste, and patriarchy are interlinked, and we see that it's in the context of marriage, family, control of sexuality, and in terms of the norms around the household in terms of food and commensality, and in the context of occupational continuity. Now, so essentially, it's the institution of marriage that provides the structural link between caste and gender. So it is marriage that holds up this link between gender and caste, because sex is tied to marriage. So if you think then of questions, for instance, of sexuality as being tied to virginity, then of course, then again, we know that a great deal of importance is placed on virginity, because again, sexuality can only be given away not by the one who has it. So it's not by the women, but by the men. Now, there's a little bit of time. I have a very, let me just see if I can. All right, I'm just sharing. I have shared another clip. Vaibhav, are you there?
Yes, ma'am.
I've just shared another clip with you. So we'll end with this little clip from the film called, again, a documentary film called World Before Her. And maybe we can, begin our next class with discussing this if you have any questions. But this ends the whole gender, the segment on family, marriage, kinship, and gender. And in the next class, I'm going to begin talking a little bit more about we're going to move to talking about bureaucracy and capitalism and so on a little bit, to look at, again, questions of social order, because what we're doing is, so we're moving now, you see, we were really talking about the private domain. We're going to move to talk a little bit more about what is considered the public domain. So, what happens outside the realm of family. So we had begun by thinking about questions of order and questions of embeddedness here in the context of gender, family, kinship. And in the next few classes, we're going to talk much more about larger systems and the public domain. So, so in the next class, we'll talk about rationality and authority and power, and yeah, so that's the plan. Yeah, so we can just see this. I think it's already time. I'm presuming some of you will have to go, but those of you who can be here can see the film clip. It's a short clip, about 5 minutes or so, I think. Yeah.
अक्षरशः मुलींचे पाय जमिनीवर नाहीत शिक्षणामुळे. त्या बाईने केवळ हट्टीपणासाठी करिअर करत बाहेर पडणं आवश्यक आहे का? इतके आपण पाश्चात्य झालो. काढा सगळं डोक्यातनं. स्त्री पुरुष समानता घटनेने दिली हो, पण एक गोष्ट आहे, निसर्गाने दिलेला दुबळेपणा लपवता येतो का? 5000 वर्षापूर्वी जेवढं शील आणि चारित्र्य महत्वाचं होतं, तेवढंच आज आहे.
Two, twist the hand with the wrist lock.
Would you kill for him? Would you?
Yes. Any moment.
Who?
Whoever go against my religion.
One.
We will not go and try to kill anyone. But when they will try to attack us, we are also not going to run away or hide out. We are going to face them. In that, if it is needed, we have to kill. We won't see here and there. We are going to kill them. Because that is not hinsa. That is not hinsa. That is self-defense, what we are doing. And I am not a Gandhi supporter. I hate Gandhi. Frankly speaking, I hate Gandhi.
A lot of people are comfortable in sharing out their inhibitions. A lot of people are not. We walk the ramp sometimes, in the skimpiest of clothes. And I'm not comfortable wearing a bikini at all, but it's part of this contest. And the emphasis is on the body. So you have to do it.
There is a dichotomy, the sense that the girls of today seem like they're very with it, very modern, but yet they have the traditional values. They have this feeling like they're going sometimes on a collision course. Should we go with the old world or should we go with the new world? When they ask me that question, I say go with the new world, because the only thing constant in life is what? Change. Otherwise, you're going to be walked over, because this new world is a very competitive world.
और झूठ बोलते तो वो गुस्सा आता है. अब झूठ बोलना चालू किया कभी झूठ बोलती है. आप देखेंगे ना उसके पैर उसके पैर पे दाग है. ये पैर में इधर दाग है उसके. बचपन में थी वो, अभी मेरे ख्याल से कम हो गया. ये है थोड़ा सा.
अभी भी
स्कूल में
7th standard
में कुछ
ट्यूशन
में कोई होमवर्क दिया था कि नहीं दिया था, तो झूठ बोला था, ऐसा कुछ बोला था. तो फिर मैंने बोला झूठ बोली है अभी, झूठ नहीं बोलना चाहिए इसमें. तो लोखंड का ऐसा तवे सा गर्म किया और उसको बोला बाहर आई. वो खड़ी थी, ऐसे ऐसे काँप रही थी, वो ठाप करके यहाँ लगा दिया उसको. फिर वो इतना ऐसा बड़ा हो गया बंदा. तो महीना भर तकलीफ हुई उसको, लेकिन वो मार्क जो है ना, दैट इज अ लेसन फॉर हर. तो झूठ नहीं बोलना चाहिए. ये तो क्या है, हमारा प्रोडक्ट है. द प्रोडक्ट हैज टू बी परफेक्ट इन ऑल सेंस.
In a traditional family, people don't let girl child live. They kill the child. So this is the thing. I get angry. I have quarrels with my dad. But this thing, when it comes in my mind, I feel like crying when it ends. He let me live. That's the best part.
All right. Anybody has any questions or comments?
Ma'am, just one thing. Ma'am, when we are discussing about the shift of descriptive to analytic, the patriarchy, then you tell that men control the women's sexuality, which is linked to honor. Ma'am, controlling women's sexuality is just like not giving enough space. They are confined to what they are being supposed to do in terms of the patriarchy. Is it that so?
So, controlling women's sexuality is, I mean, what is the outcome that one is expecting? So when women's sexuality is controlled, the outcome is that outcome is ultimately family and caste honor, because you cannot express your sexuality in the way that you want to. So if you had to do it, you would have to do it by subverting the rules and regulations, the rules and norms, right? So women, as far as possible, have to be one, virginity has to be there, because that is what that is what then is connected again to notions of purity and pollution, right? So so if you think of in the caste system how sexuality is viewed, women's sexuality is viewed in a way that it could be dangerous, right? It could be dangerous for what reason? It could be dangerous because if women choose to give away their sexuality, it impacts the very existence of the caste group. So again, hypothetically, if I think about women giving away their sexuality, not marrying within the caste group, then a caste group may not exist anymore, because once you've married outside your caste, then you're and you have had children, then because of patrilineality and patriarchy, the children do not belong to the women's caste group, right? So women have to marry within their caste in order for that caste group to be perpetuated. It means that if I want more people in my caste group, what do I have to do? I have to marry within my caste so that I have more children within my caste who stay within my caste. If I marry outside the caste, then it's not, it is the caste status of the men who I have married who are outside the caste. It is those caste groups that will be perpetuated. So every caste group wants to perpetuate their own, and in order to do that, they must control women's sexuality. So the control of women's sexuality is essential for maintaining and carrying on caste. And this control is brought into effect through relations of patriarchy, through the fact that men have, it is the male who is the head of the household, and that there are certain norms around which we justify this control. So the norm is of honor, and honor is tied to protecting women. Right, so simple thing like women are told that we should not be out late, right? Why are we should not be out late? Because it is dangerous. What do we mean when we say it is dangerous? Why is it dangerous? Because somebody may do something to you. What is that somebody doing something to you? You may be raped, right? So what does that mean? That basically that your virginity is at stake. And why does your virginity need to be protected? Why does your sexuality need to be protected? It is in order to maintain the notion of honor, the notion of family honor, the notion of honor of the kin group, and that and of the caste of caste identity. Okay. Do you have any other questions, or if you, I think some of this we can discuss in our tutorial groups, because the reading is for this week will bring up some of these questions, definitely. So I'm going to end the class, okay? Thank you.
Thank you.